Terry, would you pray us in?
Certainly. So let's just pause and take a breath on this inauguration day and give thanks for the hope for the future for our country. And also pay attention and invite Spirit to stir up in us a spirit of justice and peace, that we may find ways to express God's deepest intention for peace and harmony in our world, very locally, in our families, neighborhoods, congregation, city, and nation. And may it be so. Amen.
Amen. So did anybody, I kind of gave a brief assignment of, because we've heard the story of Cain and Abel many different times, but it has complexity to it that in a quick read doesn't jump out at us. So did anybody find other examples of Cain and Abel or sibling kind of guilt, not guilt, but kind of seeing each other as competition or danger in literature? Did anybody look at any of that up? I'll just give you, I just typed in Cain and Abel in literature and hundreds of websites popped up. So an example, people know the movie Gone with the Wind? Okay. A good example of sibling rivalry is Scarlett and Sue Ellen. Do people remember those? You probably remember Scarlett O'Hara, and Sue Ellen is the other very nice, very kind person, and Scarlett is a terror, very self-focused and such. Has anybody here, you can just lift up your finger and give us a signal. Has anybody here read The Kite Runner as a book? Amir and Hassan, two characters, two brothers that are in competition with each other. The guy who wrote Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones has so many sibling issues all through all the books and even the pre-books. It's very interesting to read those because there's this conflict between brothers and sisters, or this conflict, all the way through. Every book has a Cain and Abel story in it, which is part of that whole experience. Some other examples in science fiction, there are dozens, hundreds of Cain and Abel kinds of stories in science fiction stories, and that continues to pop up. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the conflict with Claudius is a Cain and Abel kind of story. Anybody ever read or see the movie Far from the Maddening Crowd by Hardy? Long time ago. Yeah. Again, there's literally a character name in that one, and then in Archer's book, there's a book called Cain and Abel, all about sibling rivalry. Also, Tolkien has these images again and again about Cain and Abel stories. So I just want us to get an idea. Cain and Abel is one of those core stories that people have captured and written into literature as a repeating theme through all the different ages, from Shakespeare to current writers and such. So just be aware of that. And it also doesn't have to be two brothers. It can be two sisters. It can be a brother and a sister. The story's the same. So if someone would just get us into the text, by reading chapter 4 in Genesis, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, just to get us started. If you're reading, take yourself off mute. I think Kathy was reading.
Okay.
Kathy's reading, and then Diane, you can do the next part.
Okay.
Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Okay, Diane.
Keep going, just a little bit more.
Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil.
Okay,
Okay.
right there. So here we have Cain, Abel. Their names kind of connect to the verbs in the Hebrew language. We've kind of lost that in English. But tell me something about Abel. Just from those two verses.
He kept flocks, Abel did, and the other worked in the soil.
Right. So we have kind of nomadic shepherds, and we have farmers. So we have those two perspectives. Which of these would you guess, given Jewish literature and Psalms, what is better, a farmer or a shepherd?
I would say a shepherd.
And you would be absolutely correct. Because, and this is going to get played out a number of different ways, all through Genesis and other places. The story of David is a good example of a shepherd king kind of thing. Jesus uses the image of shepherd as a primary image. He also uses farmers, but some of the farmer stories go a little sideways, you know.
Just to relate it to today, look at how farmers contest with people that are grazing their flocks, grazing their sheep, grazing their cattle.
Right.
You know, the cattle farmers don't want farmers, you know.
Yeah, the cattle guys also don't want sheep.
Yeah, that's true.
because sheep will eat the stuff right down to the ground.
Yeah.
So if someone would read verse 3 through 7.
I'll go ahead and read it.
Okay.
In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast?" Do you want me to read 7?
Yeah, read 7.
If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it.
So does God play favorites in this story?
It seems like it, but on the other hand, was he looking at what was in their hearts versus what they gave him?
But we don't know that. I mean, that is the explanation I got in Sunday school. Is somehow or another Cain's offering wasn't the first fruits, or it wasn't this, or it wasn't that. But if we just look at the text, we would have to say we're not sure that Cain's offering was any less appropriate than Abel's was. Unless you can see something I can't see. So this is the reason why I lift this up is that this is a huge controversy in the early part of Genesis. Does God know something about Cain that's just not in the text, or does God like shepherds over farmers?
Mhm.
The answer would be we don't know from the text. Now, rabbis have written tons on this stuff, and scripture scholars, but the piece here is, and God does speak to Cain. And in that verse, in verse 6 and 7, Cain is ticked off. And his countenance, it's after his offering is not accepted that Cain turns, and his countenance fell, is the language in my translation. And he's angry because he thinks he's offered appropriate offering to God. But the Lord says to Cain, why are you angry? Why are your countenance fall? God, you know the answer. You didn't show any favor. And continuing, if you do well, this is my translation, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. The actual translation word is ready to pounce. The sense of lurking is that the sin is ready to pounce on top of you is actually a better translation of the Hebrew. So do you get an idea that God is warning Cain that sin is right there? It's right there at the doorstep. So how do we deal with this idea that sin is not inside us, but is a reality that can be outside of us that's going to pounce on us? How do you feel about that?
Confused.
Go ahead. Terry, go ahead.
Well, Diane was going to talk, so go ahead, Diane.
Oh, no. And I was just going to say, I mean, having lived as many years as each of us has, we know that there's stuff around us that's always sort of sitting there trying to tempt us. I mean, all you have to do is walk out the door.
Yeah.
And so I guess to me, it would be inside and out and very evident.
It's almost as if sin is a creature in and of itself. So how does this, so think about this. God is warning Cain that says, don't go there. It's not here yet, but don't go there. Because if you do, there will be consequences.
You're talking about his anger, right?
Right. But his anger is moving towards something more. The anger is not the sin. Vengeance is the sin.
Well, I was just thinking about that. That's a very interesting verse 7, about if you do well, you'll be accepted. But if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door and you must master it. So, so I'm thinking about when we're in favor, whether, like things are going well in our lives, it's easier to manage our lives. But when things don't go easily, then that's the time when we have to be aware of falling into, bad habits. And you could just think of lots of things, like falling into stealing because you don't have enough to live on, or falling into drugs because you're depressed, or falling into, licentiousness, or lots of those biblical words, but those are they outside or are they inside? Well, they're lurking at the door, but we have to open the door somehow. And so those are times of kind of vulnerability when community has to surround people and support them in making, like in child rearing, we say making good decisions, which all of our children probably, I'm speaking out of turn, but, have made some dumbass decisions and some good decisions in their life. And, sort of like that's part of it. And then lastly, I was thinking of at least two other biblical stories, Jacob and Esau, where Esau was really the elder, but he ended up being the outcast, and kind of for the same reasons, and like, just kind of like, well, it was the preference of the mother. And then the prodigal son, where we think of, the one who ran away as the chief sinner, but the story turns it and says, well, no, it was really the older brother who stayed right there and was dutiful all the time. And his sin was, holding this against the father and the son. So that's all kind of coming out of this. If you do not do well dealing with a circumstance in your life of a failure, a disappointment, then sin is lurking at your door. I think that's really true, psychologically and spiritually. Okay, that's enough. Bye-bye.
No, but that's, the other side of this is the last part of that phrase is its desire, sin's desire is for you. So again, we have this image of this lurking sin, this lurking issue of vengeance and anger that could explode out. And it also then goes a little deeper than that. It says it's desire for you, but you must master it. Which tells us it's an interesting way to think about sin. Sin is not something that we just are tempted about and we choose yes or no. Sin is something that can master us. It can literally take control of our lives. And I think that's a very, very deep, intentional understanding for Hebrews about sin was. That sin is something that you can eventually lose your freedom about, because it will eventually master you, and you can and not be able to respond and do, in a sense, going back to what Terry just said, doing well. So keep that in mind. If someone would jump in, and we're going to read.
Can I just ask a question about that before you go on? Yeah. Is this the first time that the word sin appears in Genesis?
Yeah, because I don't think that there's any sin language in the previous chapters.
I mean, we always talk about the fall as the fall into sin and stuff, but I don't think the word sin is used. And it's just kind of striking that in chapter 4, here's this new word. So, and I'm looking at my Hebrew Bible, and
yeah, I don't see
it does use the word sin too. It does use the word sin. So I don't know what the Hebrew is, of course, but
yeah. Yeah, I'm anyway. Not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure, but it does create this that sin is not just a motivation inside us.
Right.
It can be something external, and it can take control of our lives. I think this is a very critical kind of piece to get, because what we're going to find is that in Genesis, this concept of sin keeps floating back into the text as it moves along. And we're going to get that in a number of different ways. If someone would read, let's see, if someone would read 8 through 12.
I guess I'm still unmuted, so I'll do it. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And the Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The good news, right? The good news.
Yeah, the good news. Yeah. The gospel of the Lord. So it's really important. It's a very short piece where he calls them out to the field, which is his place. That's his environment. And he kills them. That's simple. But it's interesting when God says, it's kind of God's question is, where is your brother Abel? Is similar to God in the garden when he talks to Adam and Eve and says, where are you? So is is it kind of the thing where God already knows the answer? Or is God really engaging them and saying, can you confess what you have done? It's the same thing previously, as they talk about the first interaction with the serpent and stuff. There's this understand. God's asking a question. How did you know you were naked? Kind of thing. So be aware that God is kind of engaging them. And then we get this line that has been used forever is, where is your brother Abel? I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer to that question is what? From God's standpoint. Yeah, you are. And so am I my brother's keeper? The answer is always yes. Always yes. And that changes the whole piece. So Deb, we're in chapter 4 of Genesis.
Okay.
And we're at verse 10.
Okay.
God, and then asks the question, what have you done? Listen, and then he says this, listen. He doesn't say, I'm hearing. He says, listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. He's telling Cain, you can't hide this. And you should be even able to hear your brother's blood crying out from the ground. Blood is significant within Hebrew and specifically Old Testament teaching. Blood becomes a major issue in the purity cult that revolves around the temple and offerings. Blood becomes a significant issue in terms of disease and things like that. So I mean, we know that if somebody bleeds out, they die. But blood has a very powerful, it's a powerful force within the human body. And therefore, we just need to be aware of this in some very intentional kinds of ways. Jesus uses blood images at the Last Supper. It's intended to be talking about power. It's talking about life-giving essence. And people knew what blood was and knew why it was essential. So just keep those pieces in mind. But then what we get, and now you are cursed from the ground. What was his profession? Cain's?
Farmer.
Farmer. The ground is now cursed. If the ground is cursed, then what does that mean?
Those are the consequences.
Yeah, he's not. It's not punishment.
Not going to be fruitful.
Yeah, the consequence of this sin, of fratricide, is the ground is it still knows who's shed the first blood. And the ground will not respond to you any longer. So Deb, you're right on. It will not be fruitful for you because of what you've done. And I think it's, again, this is the point I made last week. It's not a punishment for sin. It's a consequence of sin. And I hope we're getting that connection here, and we're going to hear it further on in the stories. But knowing this tells us something. We're getting a whole lot of these foundational kind of images and such that you should pay attention to. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. What does the word fugitive here means?
It doesn't belong. Or he's on the run.
Say again?
Well, I think of a fugitive as a person that doesn't belong and he's on the run.
Yeah, I'm right in the middle of a Zoom meeting, and can you give me a call back in 30 minutes? Okay, thank you. I assume this is all good. Okay, thanks. Sorry.
That's all right.
So I didn't hear the last comment.
Well, I had said fugitive to me means a person that is on kind of, he doesn't belong. He's like having to move along or run away from.
Right. And so when Cain, and I'll just read this passage, Cain says to the Lord, my punishment, he sees it as punishment, but I think God says it's consequence. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Today you have driven me away from the soil, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me may kill me. That's what it means to be a fugitive. If you're a fugitive, people can capture you, they can kill you, and there aren't consequences to that.
There aren't consequences?
Well, if somebody takes Cain out at this point, that's what it means to be a fugitive. He's open game. So when this takes place, he says, my punishment is greater than I can bear. You just killed your brother. What the heck do you expect?
Really?
And so when he says, today you've driven me from the land, you've hidden your face from me. What I want us to hear in this is Cain's response. This is not the truth. Because if God had turned his face from Cain, we're going to hear about this in a bit, well, we would find a different thing. Terry.
Well, I'm going back a little bit because I'm just kind of catching up with this story. But you know, this "Am I my brother's keeper" is the wisdom that we often hear from this story. But there's another piece of wisdom, and it's in verse 10. Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And I'm thinking about, you know, war and pandemic and injustice of any kind. It's sort of like, it's not just the people, but it's the ground.
Yeah.
You know, it's the earth that's now crying out to God, and we're asked to listen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a, and then now you are cursed from the ground. So this separation between the brothers is now expressed as a separation between Cain and the ground. And, you know, our whole environmental movement, you know, kind of whichever side you're on, is about our separation from the earth, you know, about our separation from the ground. So we're kind of sharing Cain's experience in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground.
Yeah. And in a sense, what it says is that creation is not going to respond to you as it has because of what you've done. You have and I think this is important. You have violated creation, not just broke a rule, because there isn't a rule about killing. I just want to say that. There's no rule about killing at this point. It's just wrong from the very beginning. You don't have to have it pointed out to you, because that would be an issue of obedience. That may be the problem. Right here, it's the blood itself that causes this. And then so as Cain says, my punishment, not my consequence, my punishment greater. You've driven me from the soil. You've hidden your face from me. I'm a fugitive and wanderer, and everybody may kill me. That's not what God said. Go ahead.
Separation from God.
Yeah. But this is what Cain is saying to God. It's not what God's saying to Cain. Because then what we get is, then the Lord said to him, not so. God calls his bluff and says, that's not what's happening here. All these things that you've just said are lies. Not so, says the Lord. Whoever kills Cain will suffer a sevenfold vengeance. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who came upon him would kill him. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Another literature reference. So what I want us to hear is that we sometimes take what Cain says and use that as saying, okay, and this is what's happened. This is how God's relating to you. And we think that that's what God's saying. That is not what God's saying. And God even calls him on it. Not so. I'm going to mark, yes, if somebody kills you, there will be vengeance, sevenfold. And who does vengeance should come from? Not us, but from the Lord. Okay, that's part of scripture as well. So one of the things with this is that no one can kill him. Cain leaves, he goes east of Eden. And so here we have this story about what has happened. And the same thing happened at the end of the first consequence for Adam and Eve. One of the first things God does after this whole thing has happened is he sews them clothes. God, even with the ones who have failed with this stuff, God's still there. God is protecting Cain, even though he kills his brother. That's a very important point here. God does not abandon us in the midst of our sin.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Did I miss something, or what is the mark?
Well,
Lord put a mark on
that has been debated for only about 4,000 years. And I mean that. I mean, this story is very, very ancient. It's also in many, in different words in other myth traditions and such. But it's a core principle that we have to pay attention to. So I don't know what the mark of the people have talked about it. One group of people have said, and this is actually, I think, part of Mormon tradition for a while, is that the mark of Cain was having black skin. That's in some traditions, that's what it meant, is people with dark skin or darker skin than me are people that are cursed.
Is that where eventually it came to people looking at black people as less?
In some cases.
Whoa.
It's the reason why in Mormonism, black people couldn't be even in the church, let alone being elders in the church.
Wow.
How
Wasn't
old?
Jesus dark?
Yeah, he was. He was, but not that dark. And I mean that intentionally. But because what we have to realize is that interpretation of a story like this is a fundamental basis of racism.
Wow.
That if you interpret the text that way, then all of a sudden what you're basically saying is that people that have dark skin are evil, bad, less than. So racial prejudice has a long history. The other side of this, other people have talked about the mark is that it would be some kind of tattoo on Cain that would tell people that, that this person is under God's protection or something like that. There's a lot of different explanations, but we don't know what it actually is.
What's the Greek interpretation of Mark?
I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
Because maybe that would give us insight, like we
Yeah,
were talking about.
it would probably have to go back to the Hebrew rather than to the
Hebrew.
to the Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Terry, you have your Hebrew Bible. Does it anything in that? You're still on mute.
Not that I can see. So the question about the mark,
I'd have to Google that.
Yeah. If somebody comes up with an explanation that you can share it next week. But let's for the fun of it in the next few minutes, let's read 17 through 24.
I'll read.
Okay.
Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mahu.
Yeah, say it quickly and we'll fake it.
Was the father of Methuselah, was the father of Lamech, and Lamech married two women, one named Ada and the other Zillah. Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His father's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who played the harp and flute. Zillah also had a son, Tubal Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal Cain's sister was Naamah. How far did you want me to go?
That's enough to start. What we're getting here is two things. We're getting some information, but we are getting the beginning of genealogies. And genealogies are really critical. And this is actually true to this day, is genealogies make a big difference about where do you come from? Who are your people? So it's an interesting thing that those generational conversations make a difference. Because if I know who your people are, and I have a connection to your people, even way back then we might be able to be people too, together. And that's a really critical piece. We get here, these names are names that were not just present in Jewish literature, these names are also present in other literature as well. And so the whole reality of in verse 17, Cain knew his wife, he conceived, bore Enoch, and we don't know this, either Enoch built the city or Cain built the city. The he there is, there's some question about who that refers to. But that's an important thing. So we've had a shepherd, we have had a farmer, and now we have a builder of cities.
I have a question. Where did the wives come from? Were they really
Good
sisters?
question, Kathy. We don't know. They just kind of showed up.
They were nomads.
Yeah.
So maybe they were sisters. Really.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that, people have tried to explain that line. The author of this part of the text doesn't care where they came from. But if you're going to have a genealogy, you got to have women giving birth.
Who
So
wrote
it's an important piece. And don't worry, Kathy, people read this text and go, oh, wait a minute. We haven't heard a word about wives yet. And so what is that going to mean? And so some people have tried to explain, oh yeah, these are other children of Adam and Eve. That's not what the text is implying. They don't care. They don't feel like they need to answer that question. And I think that's important to realize. Their point was not to make this a consistent narrative. It was to tell the story. Because what they want to get to is, if you think farmers were bad, city builders are the worst. Because that's going to come up again and again.
So if Cain was building the city, that means he's still doing bad even after.
Well, he's not. He may not be doing bad, but city dwellers are not as good as shepherds. They're not even as good as farmers. What I want us to hear is that even there's prejudice built into the scriptures that it implies that part of this is coming, that God has an order of preference of the careers or the kinds of people that he wants to associate with. Because as we go through here and we get all the names, and then Tubal Cain makes bronze and all kinds of iron tools. This is significant. This is significant because bronze was used for weapons.
Yeah.
It was a primary purpose. They also used it for on the ends of plows and things like that. But bronze was used for weapons. City people have a tendency to be warrior people that want to conquer other people. Then we get this little narrative. This is kind of more of a poem. probably a very, very ancient poem. Lamech had said to his wife, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 77-fold. Where do we hear that 77?
77 times 7 times that Jesus forgives.
Yeah, I think it's a direct reference to this. This is a song. Do you hear the cadence in it? This was probably a very ancient song. And so what is important that we get here is I think Jesus is implying in the same way that Lamech will be avenged for 77 times Lamech. Yeah. And we go to the next step down and Jesus says, and how often will God forgive? As many times as Lamech, who has killed people. Wow.
Was that said?
What?
Was that actually said?
Right, that's what it's saying, is that Lamech has killed, he killed a man because he wounded him. We don't have eye for an eye. Eye for an eye is not permission, it's limitation. If you strike my eye, you can only take my eye, you can't take my life. And so that there's eye for an eye is actually a limitation on vengeance. So, and part of this had to do with slaves. If a slave hurt a master, or even hurt their feelings, they could be killed. Well, Jewish law says eye for an eye is you are limited in your vengeance upon, especially if you have more power than the person you're taking vengeance on.
Did they already have slaves there at this
We don't know.
time?
I mean, it would be tough to build a city with yourself and your wife.
That's true.
But so, like I said, they're not trying to explain how this happened. You know, here we have, she conceives, has a son, and a city gets built. They're not telling us where the laborers are coming from. They don't care about that stuff. They want to make a point here. And then just as an ending, verse 25, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and his name was Enosh. At that time, people began to invoke the name of the Lord. It's the first phrase of worship and prayer. We've got cities popping up. We've got vengeance happening. We have limitations on vengeance. All these, I mean, in a few verses, we just kind of jumpstart the whole story so that we can now so that we need it as a transition so we can get to Noah. Because what we're going to have is we're going to have a story of humankind, and that's an important, that's what we're going to be covering next week. And we're going to get the continued wickedness of humanity in the beginning of chapter 6. So what I want us to see is that this last piece is a transition piece. How do we get from Cain and Abel to Noah? And all of the stuff in between gives us a reason why God comes in and says, this didn't work. This whole humanity thing just didn't work. And that's one of the big questions is, why doesn't God stop what humanity does? all the evil in the world, all the brokenness in the world, why can't we go back to Eden? That's a big, huge question. Can we go back to Eden?
Not till
Yeah.
Jesus comes back.
When
Not
Jesus
till
comes
Jesus
back?
comes back.
Yeah. Well, he came once and it didn't happen. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see. But any questions about the text as it gets stirred up? Anything that surprised you, Terry?
Well, I was spending a little time looking at how Cain and Abel are seen in the New Testament. It's very cursory, but there's two places in Matthew and Luke. It's in that list of woe to the Pharisees and scribes. And in Luke, for example, it says, so this generation may be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be charged against this generation. So the legacy continues in kind of a negative way. In Hebrews, however, there's the faithfulness of Abel is lifted up as one of the, in that listing in chapter 11 of the faithful, that's lifted up. But more interesting, in chapter 12 of Hebrews, which isn't one of my favorite biblical books, to tell you the truth, but that's a little aside. But maybe we should do a Bible study on that. In Hebrews 12:24, and I think this is pertinent to what you were saying, Mike. So I'll start a little bit ahead of that. It's sort of like you are now coming to a tender God, to a gracious God, and to Mount Zion, and to Jesus. This is verse 24, chapter 12. And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So, I mean, that's kind of an interesting, okay, New Testament interpretation that, so the blood of Abel isn't just consequence that's continued through history, but we've come to a better word, and the sprinkled blood of Jesus, which I'm not into the blood of Jesus theology too much either, but here it kind of makes sense on the basis of the Abel story. So anyway.
Well, and that was going to be part of my ending, was that.
Oh, sorry.
No, it was perfect lead in. Jesus is a kind of Abel.
Yeah.
And I think that's not, I don't think we can just, that kind of, Jesus is a kind of Abel. His blood has been sprinkled, and it's the ultimate sacrifice. And therefore, though Hebrews would disagree with me, sacrifices ended. Jesus was the perfect sacrifice. And so no more sacrifice, because Jesus has already done it, and it's done for all time. It's the reason why Luther reacted so strongly against Roman Catholic theology that the communion, the Eucharist, was a sacrificial event. Luther said, no, it's not. He did it once, and that was good for all time. So it's, Terry, your connection was absolutely appropriate, because there is this, in the midst of this stuff, all that happening. So next week, if you want to read ahead, you can read chapter 5 and basically the beginning part of 6 up to the point where, but Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord, which is verse 8, and think back to Abel. Think back to Abel. So that's going to be our text for next week. Thanks, everybody. It's getting really noisy in my office because they are finishing part of the roof project. It might be done by the end of next week.
Awesome.
All staff can say is thank God.
I'm sure. Oh,
It's-
construction is so invasive.
It's pretty much been constant, get, some days it's no sound at all, other days you can't hear a thing. So
Yeah.
they're gonna be hammering in a second. So, hey, God bless everybody.
Okay,
Thanks for
thank
being
you.
here.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.